So I have this big vision that's coming through and a set of practices, and it's taken me a long time to articulate how to teach it. And so I often get questions from people saying, which course do I take first? How do I do this? And so it's also been fun for this call to really break that down and name it. I've done lots of things in my life, but one of the things I was a backcountry guide. I worked for Outward Bound for many years. I led long 30, 40, 50-day trips through Northern Canada primarily. And that capacity to guide people, right, really informs, I guided people through stressful situations. It's kind of what I do now. So I see this in a way as almost training as a guide. Right? And I also come from a background in systemic family constellations, and we'll talk more about what those are. There's an understanding in that body of knowledge that you learn this practice through 3 steps, and I really like those steps. The first is principles, and then practices, and then stance. And so that's how the Sacred Deathcare courses are lined up. So the first is the principles, and there's a course series called The Soul's Journey. And it has 3 maps, and these are really the conceptual framework. They're very, they're images, they're ideas. It's not so much applied. There's 3 maps. One is called Grief and Loss as Initiation. So it's about the experience of those who are, as a dying person or not dying person, moving towards a death, and then bereaved after. Like, what is the soul journey of grief and loss? The second is called The Energetic Dynamics of the Dying Process, and it's about how body and soul separate in the immediate period around death, from active dying to just after death, that transition from this side of the veil to the other. And the third is called What Happens After We Die, and it's a map of the big journey from body, out of body, into body, out of body, and explains all sorts of those, like, in dreams of the dead and near-death experiences. And so it gives a framework. Those 3 are the core principles, and that's at the heart of everything I do with clients. And in the energetic dynamics of the dying process one, there's a story there I tell about this side of the river and the other side of the river, the village of the living and the village of the ancestors. And that frame is the core. So those are the principles. And then there's a second course called Awakening the Archetype of the Death Walker. And that's about the experience of those of us in whom that archetype is active and what it means to be drawn to this work and to be feeling and being kind of pulled from the inside or pushed from the inside, drawn to this, even in a culture that doesn't reward that or doesn't recognize it or validate it or support it. So it's really, it's a great place to start if you're new to this and you're trying to make sense of what's happening for you. So those are the principles. Right? And those, I made some of those courses 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 years ago now, and they still hold. That's the structure. That's the map. Right? The second section is the practices. It's like, how do we navigate the territory based on this map? And so that's a series called Doing Death Better. The first one's called When Death is Coming, Holding Space at a Deathbed. There's one coming on What Happens After the Last Breath, Planning a Funeral, and Grief. So it's a step-by-step through the journey. How do you do it based on those principles? And it's really an introductory guide. And again, I think back to guiding. If you're going to go camping, first you learn to take your family camping before you lead a trip and take 15 other people in the woods. So the Doing Death Better is about the basic, like, how do you do it for yourself? Just the how-tos of that level. And people have been asking for years for me to do a Death Doula certification program. And I just don't feel like I can until I get all this stuff lined up in place. In terms of practices, there will at some point be another set of practices, which is essentially how to be a guide, which is how do you manage your own energetic dynamics in your energy body? How do you work with families? How do you deal with this? How do you diagnose? How do you prescribe? That more complex level. So those are practices. And then the third is stance. And this is a long, winding path, takes us to the Across the Veil Constellations, right? This is where they fit into this 3-part model: principles, practices, and stance. So the principles are conceptual. Right? They're what you know. They're how to analyze it and how to articulate it. The practices are pragmatic. They're what you do. There's how to enact it, right? How to apply it. And the stance is more about embodiment or resonant frequency. It's about who you are. It's about actually being so, it's not about knowledge, it's about knowing. It's about actually just carrying this in your system so much that when you walk into a space, you bring it with you. Right? And that frequency actually changes things. So it's this somatic, intuitive, energetic, felt relationship with this material. And so the Across the Veil Constellations are a kind of ritual learning laboratory, an opportunity for this experiential education around these archetypal structures, to get it into our energetic and physical bodies, not in our head. So we really deeply embody these principles. And I've talked often about the fact that the medicine body, so it's sort of your healer's energetic structure. It acts as a kind of tuning fork in the space. What we carry into the space is what we know and what we do, principles and practices, but who we are. And at an energetic level, we kind of lend that energy to people while they find it for themselves. I lend somebody my lack of fear. It's like, this is hard and I know you're scared, but I'm not scared. And you can borrow some of my not scared until you can be not scared. I lend a confidence, a faith, a just knowing that there is a way through this, right? And it's a nuanced energetic dynamic, but lending is the best way to say it. It's like they're not running through my system. I just lend them that, like a tuning fork. You can use mine to tune to, and that stability helps. It's like back to the outdoor metaphors. It's like a handrail, a rope to the barn in a snowstorm. You can just feel along this until you get there. So that's where stance fits in.